nothing but the highest respect for somebody like that to show up to what is clearly going to be a very high percentage base of people that are eating tons of red meat, that are eschewing carbohydrates, and know their stuff and know their facts about veganism, that kind of thing. I have nothing but respect for him to be able to show up. Again, he didn't change my mind about anything, but kudos to him
Yeah.
to be able
And
to
his
show up. And
generosity too. It's fair to point out that he gave a very generous contribution to the raffle. And like all the speakers that participated, his expenses were completely out of his pocket. So, that in that sense too, that should be acknowledged.
yeah, for sure. He kept saying, like, I've got all these books, they're in the lobby, you can just come have them all the time. I'm like, what do you mean you've got books that you're just giving out to people for free? Like, that's really nice of you. I didn't take any, but yeah, anyway, I thought that was really interesting. um I don't know where you want to dive in as far as this goes, and where the debate kind of starts. I think the key point that I really like that you've said in conferences past is the idea that we need to shift to a plant-based diet. We're not plant-based enough. We need to move in the direction of being plant-based. And you've made some really key points around that have really stuck with me. Maybe we could start there.
Well, yeah, and we could put those under the umbrella of what I call details, definitions, and denominators, right? I mean, the devil is in those topics. And so um, when someone says that, that they advocate for a plant-based diet, well, how plant-based? Right? The majority of calories in humanity's diet already come from plants, right? Over 50% of calories in humanity's diet come from rice, wheat, and corn. That's poor source of nutrition when you get to things like protein. And then the majority of our protein, in quotes, comes from plant sources, not animal sources. So how much more are we talking about? In Africa, for example, 7% of calories come from animal source foods. Well, how much more do you want? In the US, it's less than 30%. How much more are we? So those details matter. Um, I use two quotes from Dean Ornish, just making the point that I agree with Dean Ornish. One is that what's good for you is good for the planet, and what's good for the heart is good for the brain. Now, those are quotes that are attributed at least to him, and I agree with those quotes, but I very much suspect that we're going to differ on the details. In other words, I think what's good for the heart is a ketogenic diet, which then aligns with the work of people like Georgia Ede and Chris Palmer in metabolic psychiatry and metabolic mind. I absolutely, there is no sustainable food system without livestock, period, full stop. And especially so with ruminants as part of that system. So I think we want sustainable food systems. The grasslands are our most endangered biome, far more than the forests. The prairies at one point were described as the kidneys of the Mississippi, and yet those prairies have largely been converted into cropland, which then leads to, you should pardon the expression, downstream problems. And, it's easy to sort of talk about some of these things and sound like you're casting judgment on our grandfathers, right? And that smacks to me of ingratitude. We stand on the shoulders of giants. And there were reasons, it's sort of like, what was it? Who was it that said, or maybe it was Chesterton, said, before I'll let anybody tear down a wall, I'll want them to tell me why it was there in the first place.
Mm.
And so people with very little understanding of some of these systems are very confident in what the solution is. And I understand that the rule of unintended consequences still reigns. Um, so all of those things are points that I wanted on the table and part of the conversation. Um, the last one to mention is just the concept of nutrient dense and nutrient density. And I would simply point to Amber O'Hearn's presentation from a few years ago, where she made the point that how are you what are the criteria for that? So if you're interested in nutrients per gram, then take a multivitamin, right? That's nutrient dense. Well, most of us would say, nah, we'd rather our nutrients come from whole food, right? Rather than isolated components in a supplement. Um, you know, the USDA and Health and Human Services in their dietary guidelines, they have an official definition for nutrient dense, and it's explicitly low fat because they don't consider fat a nutrient. And so the presence even of naturally occurring fats, the fats that come naturally as part of the food, are seen as only diluting the other nutrients that are provided. And so when people start throwing around a phrase like nutrient dense, I want to raise my hand and then point to the ludicrous example from the dietary guidelines where they consider sparkling water as being nutrient dense alternative to soda.
One of my
Or
favorite
the,
slides of all time that you used in a presentation. I love that.
so these are points, and then there's sort of more, um, well, I do rely on the statement that humanity's existential crisis is too little animal source food.
Mm.
So, we have people who truly or otherwise believe that there are all these chronic illnesses that humanity is suffering from that are due to consuming too much animal source food. We could spend a lot of time talking about how they got to that belief. But on the other hand, I think there's high quality evidence of, in fact, it's the result of too little.